Right.
Creative projects.
No. Yeah, right.
You look serious.
Thinking about whether I really need to go get my
Where?
I get anxious. You don't know exactly what you're doing and where you're trying to go.
So they can't. They're nice. Well, today she got some wine meal that yesterday. Last night, different pastures, they call it like
Yeah, it's stuff like that, and you can turn around and like a Tigers game, and parents right? And it was like, I just get on the road and drive until I ran into a crossroad that I recognized, and then I would turn and go, just hope I was heading north.
I don't know the whole place.
Yeah, cause like in Grand Rapids, we have, Metro, which is part of the.
So that's not counted.
That's not, but you got 13, okay. Cause I'm doing a lot of work with Spectrum Health in Grand Rapids, and I was trying to compare the size. Cause Spectrum Health is in West Michigan. But that includes, like, they go up to Lexington, all the way down to.
Fireplace Major Ormond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cause that's your big competitor, or they look at you. But, well, in Grand Rapids, there's two things. There's like the University of Michigan with Metro, and then there's Spectrum, and both of them are massive.
Oh, what a terrible job.
Yeah.
Who do you do with it?
At Metro, I haven't done any work with Metro. I'm doing work at Spectrum.
Sylvia.
It's funny, cause he's been
Oh, okay. Yeah,
moving.
I haven't go to.
It's
But I don't work for
Oh,
my
counterpart
does.
It's
So I don't actually know
right now it's got Kelly.
But I can pass, so I don't have no way really. So she always down there.
So now I touch you,
Okay.
I can get it to change.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Right, or I can get it to.
I know, right?
One in Rome.
I know, front row.
Her name's Erna.
Oh, she's here. Oh, she texted it, I'd be a little bit late, so.
Look, Chef, has your lunch, she's right here.
Okay.
So we're waiting for Tom, and
Oh, he's in today.
Renee's on her way. Is Tom here?
I don't think
He's
he's
sick,
in today.
Joe's that?
I don't know.
I tried to check on him multiple times, cause I didn't think he was off today.
I haven't seen him all day. His door's been closed.
Do we only have one manager?
He might be sick too. No, we got two, I said we'd have at least two.
Oh, right, yes, you're right, I forgot.
Di would probably know though, cause if Tom's sick, then Di would cover.
With another firm, but right now, they're very keen on working with us, and we'll see about,
I can speed it up, like it.
everybody's kind of like,
It's just gotta say.
this is everything.
So I put it in
Cause when it switched,
Okay.
Oh, right.
it didn't go like crazy.
Yeah. We just, haven't had tried to test it for chaos in this room, which I've already built like organizations, that's why we're just. Say I pitch it, it's gonna work. But that's going back to Steve said, I'd rather just get it in front of the pressing this way, cause then it might recognize all of our faces. You know what I mean? So if we were contributing, it might zoom in like this.
No,
You can see it there, that's what's live streaming is
there's something going on
versus if we go to here, it's the back street side.
They had a site on outside of downtown.
Right.
I think the viewing angle would come all the time. Cause we would do it.
It's fine.
Oh.
It was there.
That's rearranged the room, so we don't see us.
And like this.
Everybody faces here.
So one of the.
Yeah, but you're not gonna be able to get to it. Oh, you think the cable's long enough to change it all the way out to the front?
Like I was thinking.
Just because the angle of the
making sure
camera.
that they control the information that goes out.
I was just gonna get it back.
Oh, yeah, that's why it's behind
They
you.
found out
What was
because
that?
Careful, I'm just gonna turn it this way.
that they were given privacy, you know, the whole thing.
You wanna hang your coat up? It might get cold in here though.
I'm gonna leave it
Yeah.
because it might get cold.
There's
Yeah,
a coat.
sure enough, something that we use.
Yeah, go ahead and grab a seat here in the middle, like anywhere in the center.
So, no, it was really accurate.
You're a girl first. Super fun.
Yeah, yeah, and we knew exactly what was going on.
But she's a steward, so she says she can't talk, so.
Okay. Like, send Sarah a message to check on the top.
Louise, I'm glad, he probably just moved out.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
We have one person that might mostly
Okay, so
on in, but I think
we'll get started.
go ahead, yeah.
Do you wanna say something?
Yeah, I'll say something to get us started.
Why are we here?
Yeah, so, welcome to, our, what I think we captioned as our manager's workshop. As we were talking about, though this morning and in the hours we were setting up in here, we're kind of defining manager as both in title in the department, as well as in each of your roles around the room as a champion for your respective teams, okay? Part of our goal here today is to go through some exercises, some brainstorming, to help understand a little bit more about how we each sort of define what creativity means and is in our workspaces, and how a space like this with the tools at our disposal might set us up to think differently and encourage our peers to think and work differently as we go forward. So I'm hoping as we do a few exercises together today that we're gonna be able to brainstorm, understand where we all see ourselves, both individually as well as our teams, and then be able to kind of see a roadmap to how we can work differently in the future. So thank you guys all, especially those of you who spent 5 hours in this room with us on Friday, helping prepare and plan all of our education and our demo areas and things. So thank you again for the extra 90 minutes that you're providing with us today to help continue push us further on our roadmap to implementing the space. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks,
Uh-huh.
Brandon, I just want, it looks amazing.
Oh,
Huge.
yeah.
The room does. Oh, I thought you said me. I'm like, kids. I'm like, I have been trying to eat healthier.
I will say that you guys look amazing in these chairs, though. I have to say, I
They
do
are
notice that.
comfortable.
Yeah, I love the perch style you have. It looks great.
Right. Sorry. we
So
have
obviously the
one.
space is working.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. So you probably all know each other, but you don't know who I am unless
Yeah,
you
and
know.
I'll enter before we go to the superstar right here. I'm Tidre Staples, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the local representative for Steelcase, and I work very closely with you guys and with NBS, our authorized dealer, and most of you may know Sachi.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And Diane.
Always pronounce it
Okay,
here.
I just wanna make sure everybody, and with that, I'm gonna be assisting and taking notes today, and, but Rich is really, owning the show, so thank you guys for coming. We
Do
really
you want
appreciate
us
your
to
time.
introduce ourselves?
That would be really
so that
good.
you
Yes.
know? Well, you know me, I'm Kate Stahl. I am with the Activation Management Group here. So, my group works on taking, a project from construction completion to actual movement, so phones, computers,
Oh.
that kind of thing.
I'm Steve Fox, I'm in the Facilities Electrical Engineering Group. So we're mainly working with existing facilities and systems. We had a big stack of paper on the back of our desks that we're looking to transition beyond.
Got it. You wanna?
Yeah, I'm Kelly, I work with the Lead Design Group. Mostly our group is comprised of architects, but there's also more space planning type people like me and Louise.
Yeah, I'm Louise Mello, work with Kelly, my background's IT.
Oh, okay.
Brendan Wild, you guys all know me.
Dawn DeLong, I'm also with the Living team, and I have a dual role as architect and wayfinding coordinator.
Josette Thompson, I work with the documentation team, so space data, floor plans, 360 buildings.
Dawn Kurtz with equipment.
My name's Lois Berg, and I'm manager of interior design and capital equipment.
My name is Renee Cruz, and I'm with the interior design group here.
Okay, thank you. So my name's Rich Benoit. As TJ mentioned, I'm with Steelcase, and I'm a consultant with our applied research and consulting group. So I have a very different role than TJ. I happen to be based in Grand Rapids and part of a global team. In fact, I leave here and I'm heading to London for, to work on with a client out there with a couple of my colleagues. But it's a global practice of how we take all the research that we do through our Workspace Futures group and actually help, our partners figure out, where they might take advantage of that research. And the process we do a lot of times, something like this, is more, we talk about this self-discovery process, trying to help uncover how you might work differently, what might be the appropriate strategy, and how you might transition into some of those things. So Kate had asked for some ideas around how we might be able to help facilitate some way to think about working differently in the future. And obviously you've got a room which you obviously think people look good in, which is the first thing. If people look good in the room, they'll want to come in. If they look bad in the room, it's kind of like, you've got these, the webcam on these devices, and it's kind of interesting because I will tell you my experience. People in the Midwest hate being on video. So we ask people like, well, I work from home. Like, well, yeah, but you can Skype in. Like, oh, I never use the camera. Like, that's so invasive. So when you have a face-to-face meeting, how important is it to get that person's reaction? Oh, it's really important because you get so much information through the body language. Okay, so have you ever thought about all of those signals you miss because you're on the phone? Yeah, but that's different. Like, no, not really. So it's interesting. So again, it's the idea of how people need to start thinking differently about getting their work done. So we're going to use this sort of format around the creative process. And when I say creative process, that's a pretty broad term because there are people who think, well, creativity is about what the designers do. Like, no, that actually has nothing, that really has nothing to do with it. That just actually is one way. In the world of business, creative thinking is all about problem solving. And when we look at the evolution of work, problem solving is the #1 issues any organization faces. So even at Google, they have changed their hiring profile because what they used to look at were the whiz-bang coders. So you couldn't even apply to Google if you were not at the top of your class in IT sciences and you really understood all about the computer. And then they realized that's not their differentiator. People can learn how to do that okay, but getting people who are able to think constructively and be able to sort of dissect an issue to really start to think, how do we solve this? And so it's all about design thinking. And so a lot of the work that we do in leading groups through something like this is all based on user-centered design, design thinking principles. It's now translated, if you have IT teams working in Agile, it's the same thing. You're focused on the problem before you've determined the solution. In the world of business, everybody wants to determine the solution first and work towards that. So when you're programming, somebody tells you where to end up. Nobody talks about what people do in the space. They tell you what they want. We need a place for 75 people, and we need 75 people, which in a university means we need 62 private offices, one really big conference room, a kitchen for the coffee, and then the rest of the staff, we don't really care. And that's probably overgeneralizing, but maybe not. And so, they're focusing on what the solution is, not necessarily, well, what is the problem? So a real creative process is incredibly iterative. You're sort of in the world of Agile, going back to that. How many of you are familiar with Agile? Is that something that keeps coming up? So the idea of the Agile process is you're trying to figure out minimum viable product. So rather than going to the end result and hoping you got it right, you start with what creates value, and then you keep adding to that. So it's a very different mindset about doing everything incrementally and testing it and then moving forward. So the value of a space like this is it's a prototype. It's not a pilot, it's a prototype. It's an experiment. Things are gonna be good, people look good, check that box. There may be some things that actually don't work, which is great, because you know, before you take the concepts of a room like this and try to expand it throughout the rest of the organization, really understanding why it's working is incredibly valuable, because you want to replicate the essence of what's working and then adjust the things that aren't working as like you expected. So you'll find things in here that, like, you know what, no one ever really uses that piece, or we really wanted to configure it like this, but there was some limitation, like, okay, so maybe it's a different component. Or maybe the room size, you know, if it was like 2 feet wider, we could do these other things. And those are the things you're going to learn by working in a space like this. And you should use it as an experiment and document it. What are the things that, we had a session in here with this many people, and we did this, and it was great. And then we tried doing this in here, like, ooh, something just wasn't quite there. But you need to document and measure that. And so where I wanted to kind of start with thinking, you know, how we get the creative process even started, it always starts with somebody's got an idea. Somebody's got a question that they're trying to solve for. And it starts really about, I am doing something. And so this idea that, you know, when people think about, well, brainstorming or a creative process, about, we gotta bring everybody together. Well, you don't, in most situations, unless people have the time to think through on their own, they tend not to contribute. So when they get people like, everybody should be in here, well, yes, you need to react to something. So this now starts to get bigger and bigger as you bring other people in. And we talk about this as being divergent thinking. And it's really about expanding that thought into something where we're not bringing everybody into this, and it becomes a much bigger endeavor. So what really drives innovation is the value of that hunch, and then the collected experience and context of a larger audience to take that hunch and start to move it so that you start to grow it and start to get bigger and bigger. And then, so we talk about this, sort of this divergent thinking, and then we start to think about convergent. And now we're starting to get back to, you know, somebody here that's now taking this back over here. So we start to go through this cycle. And then as we get here, now all of a sudden we've got this, you know, I should be able to draw a light bulb. I was a lighting engineer at one time. How we get to these ideas is we start and it becomes an embryonic kind of thing. We kind of bring it out, we get lots of feedback, and then we start to pull it back in. So this is all about the we, you know, we get the bigger we in here, and then we get less of that collective thinking, because ultimately when we get to this, we have to have a point of view. Otherwise, it rambles. Somebody has to own the idea, and one of the things that really trips up organizations with innovation is somebody, one person, has to own the idea. You can't let 16 people own the idea. You will, oops, here we go. You will never get to a solution because you're trying to drive to consensus. And innovation is not about driving to consensus. When you drive to consensus, you go all the way back to the beginning and you keep doing the same thing you've always been doing. And so in order to get here, you have to have somebody that's willing to challenge the system and realize that innovation is about doing something you have not done before. And there is a risk of failure. If you don't fail, you don't learn. If you don't learn, you don't proceed. And so you never really kind of you start to move forward. So in the world of driving creativity, organizations have to get comfortable with this is not about the traditional hierarchical arrangement where we send people out to do a project, they report back, and I decide whether that's the right thing or not. But if you're truly trying to drive innovative thinking, you have to drive autonomy and ownership down within the rank and file. Because it's people who have good ideas. And they have to feel empowered and safe in order to challenge the system. Because if they don't feel, if risk of failure is so significant, people will just stay in their little cubbies and just do what they're told. And in the world of work, that's not good enough anymore. Organizations thrive and grow through innovation. Innovation is completely dependent on people coming up with new points of view that support the system. And this isn't necessarily just about, companies thinking about, well, we do new products. All the work you all do, you have to think about your work differently. And that's what keeps organizations sustainable. Because when you look at in the world of the competitive market, and granted, healthcare is still very much a competitive market, you still need to be, on top of your game, just like any other commercial business would be. So whether it's in your mission may be different. It could be, it is about patient care and your access within the community, and the way that you, the way that you treat employees and that whole experience of being as part of the University of Michigan health system. All of those are important, and everything you do, particularly what you guys do, touches everything. And so, there's another, let's say, comparable organization in Ohio that is taking a very different tack on their real estate. And their mindset is, it is all about the patient. And if you're not patient facing, you're basically a commodity, and they're taking everything, all the resources away from the back end. I'm like, I'm not sure this is like a really good idea. And this is a really big and famous facility. But their mindset is, real estate's expensive, people are disposable. If you're not patient facing, like we're just gonna shove you in to this open area, and you kind of fend for yourself. Because they're looking at how much they're spending in real estate for the back end, for what's behind the curtain. Like, I'm not, but good luck with that one.
Let me know how it works.
Yes. So, all of the work that all of you do collectively really start to support the bigger part of the organization. So does this make some sense? So again, we're just sort of setting some context. So the other thing I wanted to really put is, okay, when we get into this divergent phase, lots of people keep talking about collaboration. And, that became this huge buzzword about 10 years ago, and everybody's like, we need more collaboration. So the pendulum swung from everybody was isolated in a private office to let's just shove everybody in a big room and sit shoulder to shoulder where everybody can see each other, everybody can hear each other, and work kind of fell apart. Because it was a great real estate strategy to shove everybody in a room, because if you can fit more people in the room, if you're a real estate executive, you get the gold star. Because look at how much real estate I saved. The fact that nobody could get their work done is not real estate's problem. That's HR's problem. And so companies that did that are all like, years later realizing that they, it's great that they saved all this money on real estate. The fact that the work isn't getting done is now becoming so blatantly obvious that they have to go back and sort of fix that. Or the companies that send everybody home to work. IBM 25 years ago started sending people home to work and started talking about the billions of dollars they saved in real estate. And then last year they had to buy $25 $1 million worth of furniture from us because they brought all those people back to work because they realized none of those people actually got any work done. So, there is this sort of mentality of, great, you can save money on the real estate, but what's really expensive are people. Your real estate's a little more expensive because you got like really expensive equipment. So your ratios are up, but in the traditional work world, the, space is 8 times the cost of the employee. In your case, you're probably more like 6, cause, you know, of the overhead, but ultimately, it's people that are the most expensive asset within any enterprise, and so people sort of forget about it's the value that they do, value the work they do. So when we talk about collaboration, one of the things that I think will be helpful to sort of think about, well, of course, sure, we're all collaborating, is we actually have modes of collaboration. So the first one is informative. And so we bring people together to make sure they all know something. And it typically is leader-led, it's a little bit less interactive. Sometimes it could be like, why didn't you just send out an email? But sometimes, you know, we have lots of, certainly at the leadership level, that love to have an audience because they love to see people come and listen to them. So that's why we have to have a department meeting because I have to feel like I have to justify my job. I'm the manager, so I have a department meeting so people can see that I'm the manager, and I can all tell them that, you know, we're going to be closed for Christmas this year, and, you know, like, let me know when you're taking vacation and make sure you put it on the calendar because I have to make sure I feel important. So, you know, we have all been there, huh?
Yeah.
So it really is about sharing information, and there's not a lot of dialogue. And again, the spatial needs for an informative dialogue is fairly limited. You need people to bring in a room and it becomes sort of one way. Where it starts a little more interesting is evaluative collaboration, where now we're getting into decision making. And so we bring people together to be able to share different points of view to make a decision. And so one of the, you know, issues that lots of organizations struggle with is, well, how do we make decisions? So again, we talked a little before, is it about building consensus? Is it about having some sort of business metrics that make, you know, so you'll look at pros and cons? Or is it, you know, people come in with all kinds of spreadsheets? Sometimes there's lively debates about, well, my idea is better than yours, and it becomes totally a visceral reaction to, you know, or who's friends with who, so we know, like, well, we want to align ourselves with this person versus that one. So decision making can get really really dicey in some organizations, but the dynamics around evaluative collaboration are very different than informative, because you need to have people really engaged, and it really is about understanding different points of view. So having multiple sources of information to compare and contrast is really important, because you can't look at one thing at a time. People need to look at multiple points of reference so they can see A, B, maybe C. Oh, okay, I see that, I see that, I see that, so that they can actually assimilate the information. So you're looking at lots of things simultaneously. And the third one is generative. This is where we start to create new ideas and new content. So we think about things like brainstorming. So the activity that we do here is more about starting with something and building on it, which again is a very different activity. So when we talk about collaboration, all of these fall under collaboration, and rather than saying, well, we need a meeting room because we're collaborating, how do we get a better handle on how a space might impact all of these? So we know that people are basically sitting here and listening. We know that people here, you know, in the evaluative, we basically are trying to assess multiple pieces of information, make a decision. When we get into generative collaboration, we're trying to keep people really engaged and active. So when you think about a space like this, which of these three would this space be most valuable for?
Generative.
So right there, that gives you an idea of like what kind of activities, would you come into a space like this? So you have people going by and like, so that's why calling this a, if you were to call this a conference room, which I know you're not, but people are like, well, it's a meeting room. It's like, well, it's not really a meeting room. Because when people will walk in, if they're coming, they think they're coming to a meeting and they look at this room and think, we can't have a meeting here. Like, well, how would we meet here? Cause there's no table in the middle of the room. And so for some people, just putting them in a different environment will start to change their behavior. So the first time people walk in here, you know, you were all, that's why I asked, most of you were here on Friday, cause I asked like, well, if this is gonna be their first experience in a room like this, you know, some people are gonna have to adjust to, you know, being in a space like this because they're used to being around the table. And all of a sudden you think about even the way this is set up, you know, it's not that it's really hierarchical, but you've got people who are willing to sit in the front and people who want to sit in the back. And that's perfectly normal, that will happen. If we were to set the tables up differently and we put the 4 tables in the middle, had you all sit around there, that would have changed the dynamics a little bit. And it's not that it's a right or wrong at all, it's about what is right for the group that's in there. And the fact that everything here moves around gives the opportunity to the people who are coming in to do what they need to do. But people have to figure out for themselves, like, how should it be configured? So they're gonna have to experiment with it. Cause some of those experiments are going to fail. They're gonna set it up and kind of go, ooh, this is kind of really awkward. And like, that will happen. But that's part of the learning process. And so I think one of the most valuable things you can do, that if you're having a session in here, do something with the furniture. So that every time somebody comes in, it's something maybe is wrong, or something's in the, you know, something like, well, why do you put it here? Especially for people that tend to be a little, there's a little bit of trepidation and apprehension. Do something that will force them to do something differently in the room. So like if you put the chairs in the wrong place, there's not, you know, even if like these were like against the wall and there's not enough seats, make them go get it. And make them become engaged with using the room. Because they'll just simply sit there and say, yeah, I don't like it. Make them an active part of the learning process. Because we talk about helping people go through some sort of transition, it's experiential. Telling people how to use the room is never going to work. They have to come in and they have to figure it out for themselves. But the more that they get involved in actually using the room, the more likely they're gonna be able to adjust. Because now they become part of the process. So, I mean, we've even done in some cases where we actually had them push all the furniture to one end of the room. And when the group came in, you had to go get what you needed. So you're forcing them to think through, well, how would I actually use it? But rather than having sort of like predetermined setups, at the end of the meeting, you know, every so often the furniture just goes all the way in the corner and people are forced to figure it out. And all of a sudden they realize, oh, there's way more flexibility. And what you'll start to see is, how do people really want to use the room? Because if it's set up like this, more than likely people will come and just use it the way it is. You know, they won't necessarily start to move things around because and it may not be ideal, but it's like, well, this is how it was set up. And then you'll always have ringers, like hopefully yourselves, that will come in and like, you know what, we're gonna put those 2 tables here and those 2 will go here, we're gonna, you know, you'll do that, but don't just do it yourself. Make the people who come to the meeting, make them do it. So, and then thinking through what these activities are, so that you can think about, okay, so we know that particularly for generative collaboration, the more active people are, the more engaged they are. So one of the things about why those tables go all the way up, and you've got those, you know, people can kind of stand around, is that standing postures actually accelerate cognitive processing. It's a neuroscience thing. It's not something we made up. So people used to talk about standing meetings for years because they believed when people had standing meetings, they would get tired of standing, so they'd want to hurry up and finish the meeting so they could go sit down. It's actually way more complicated than that. Because you're standing, it forces more blood flow to your brain, so you actually are more engaged and more present. So you end up actually moving through the content faster, because you can't just sit back and snooze, basically. And so, what's interesting now is when we start to see this idea of being present, that the physical part of it, of being present, actually has a very, very positive impact on the cognitive load. So there's actually something more to it. Even in the the sort of the lounge postures, it's you're more likely to get up out of your chair because you have free access to the board. So that's very, very deliberate, as opposed to if I have to walk, if Diane has to come all the way around the table, she's gonna have to think twice about it. But if you're right there, like, oh yeah, hey, you know what, I need you're more likely to do that. So this is why all of these separations in here really do make sense, because it just drives more activity. So I'll stop there. Any questions? Because I just want to give you some context, okay, around sort of like where we're going to hit. So when you think about your roles, and this is going to become a little brainstorming exercise for all of you, is thinking about, I've got this poster, creativity at work. So that's a pretty open-ended question. So what I want you to do is, there's Post-its and Sharpies around the tables, is I'll give you a couple minutes to think about what is creativity for you? And I want you to think about the process, or the environment, or the need even. Where are the opportunities to drive more innovative thinking through the organization? And I'm going to keep it really broad at this point, and then we're actually going to do another exercise that's going to, right now we're at this, we're at this divergent thinking thing. What is it around creativity that you believe, sort of drives why is it important? How does it get done? How do you go about doing it? What does it mean to the organization? So think about pretty broadly, because we're in this divergent phase, and then I'm gonna, bring it back in, and we're gonna bring it back to like, how might you think about how space can start to impact some of those things, okay?
How many can we write?
As many as you want. I'm not gonna, yes, people always say, well, you should write, some of you have a lot to say, so I'm not gonna put a limit. I will put a time limit. I'll give you a couple of, like 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
So as many as you'd like.
Was the question, what is creativity to us again? I realize there's so many answers, I'm not sure if I.
Yeah, what is creativity?
To us.
Yes. I want you to take, to you here, as opposed to something that creativity at home, but creativity, and I would say in the work experience. So it's like had to do with where you work, how you work, the tools maybe, the process, the output, the value, any of those are good. think I'm gonna cut you off just because there's a lot of them. But yeah, if you, I want you to put them up on the poster.
We didn't tell you we extended the workshop till 4:00.
Just wherever, I'll.
Is it
I'll-
okay to spill
yeah.
over into the
Oh,
box
yeah,
for it?
yeah,
Okay.
oh, yeah.
Hey, you're not being very creative in the way you put them off.
And what, where I put them up?
All in a line.
Shoot, okay.
You know, we always watch how people put their Post-its up, and there clearly is something culturally with different companies, and the way people, oh yeah, nothing I could talk to specifically. Oh, you'll get some where they'll actually all line them up, and then somebody will go and line them, and then other people will go and put them all over. They can't even put them on the poster. Like, she can't even draw within the lines.
Thinking outside the box.
Never could and never will.
That just shows the value of having the whiteboards to do this.
Lined up.
Short, so.
Yeah.
I didn't share her short, I said, "Oh."
I'm just saying, we can bend over.
Oh, I love it. Look at all those ideas.
Oh, yeah.
So great.
All of it.
Who had the most?
Where the
Green.
it wasn't a contest.
That light green.
Was that Brendan?
So,
That was 3 people. 2 or 3 people.
it doesn't work.
I did that on purpose.
You did that on purpose?
Yes.
Okay. I used to, the group I had last time, it took forever to get them to write like one Post-it. They were,
That's
it
funny.
was the engineers.
Of course it was.
So there's, I mean, there's just, it's wow, I mean, this is awesome because you've got, like, there's just, like, a completely random, which, again, I was looking like, alright. But I think that, I like this, the ways to make work fun, because engagement, I mean, a big part of driving to new solutions is through engagement. And, you know, engagement is about this discretionary effort that people give at work, and that's where innovation comes from. People who are task-centric tend not to be your most creative people. They come to work and they do what they need to do, and that's about as far as they go. And we know that that's in the general workforce, that's a huge percentage of knowledge workers, is that they do enough work to not be fired. You know, that's sort of the predominant, you don't have, oh, see, you're ahead of the curve. This is in the big world of work. And so for organizations to really thrive, you've got to have more people not in that category of like enough work to not be fired, or the ones that just basically take up a parking space and drink the coffee and spend most of their day looking for another job. There's, you know, some of those, that's like 11%. So how do you engage people, you know, to want to be part of this creative process? And this is where mission and purpose becomes so important to organizations. Now, your purpose is pretty clear, why you guys are in business, so people who come to work here really know what they're getting themselves into. So you actually, that's a huge advantage, because there are companies that don't have like a really good mission statement, they don't have a purpose, people go there and they just go because it's a job, and that's as far as they get. And so, you know, even being in the organization to begin with starts to drive that. But, you know, part of this is, you know, thinking outside the box, you know, not assuming. I like this, staying fearless, and there was another one, there was more about these, and seeing what other places do. So benchmarking, you know, in healthcare, benchmarking is kind of important because you actually are all learning from each other. So I always get a little nervous when, especially in the spatial thing, well, we want to go see what somebody else did. I'm like, yeah, but do you know why they did it? You know, that's very different than when you look at, on the clinical side, clearly you're watching what other hospitals do on the clinical side, because that's the learning opportunity. And so that's, you know, when somebody has an issue and you have a procedure that's, you know, cause and reaction is very simple. In an environment, it's a little bit different. I like this, the white wall. Is this your new white wall?
What's a blank slate, right?
The
Like all
blank-
the possibilities.
Yep. What isn't working now? This is a really good way to start to assess when you think about the creative process, because if you don't understand where your baseline is, because one of the things that gets really tricky when you're going through some sort of innovation or creativity process is, how do you know you've got something better if you don't measure it? So people change for the sake of changing. Well, you know, we get asked all the time, after an installation, well, can you help us measure the increase in productivity? Like, well, what was it before? Like, well, we don't know. Like, well, how can we tell it was different if you don't know what it was before? And then, well, how do you measure productivity? Like, no, we thought you would know. Like, we make furniture. Like, you know, if we knew how to measure productivity, we wouldn't make furniture. We'd sell that because it'd be much more lucrative. You know, exploring and discovering, you know, part of daydreaming, and I think part of that is listening, because innovation is really about listening. If you come to work every day with all the best ideas, you know, you may have some brilliant ideas, not one of you can actually execute and implement that idea all by yourself. So the world of work is changing, and so this is where we start to, why teamwork is so critical, because nothing can get done by any individual anymore. You know, even Edison had a big team behind him that nobody ever talks about, but he didn't do it all by himself. But, you know, and then again, you know, a lot of those ideas are kind of gone now. So, you know, everything left to invent is a lot more difficult. So the what if, going through that, you know, not assuming empowerment, you know, obviously is a very important, asking lots of questions, the lots of trial and error, the laughter, that was the, what's the fun one? Making more fun, laughter. Being empowered to make choices, we talked about that, finding a better solution, finding the value in plan B. Again, this failure thing, knowing that failure is part of the process. Process judgment-free, which is obviously you know, part of that, because you don't know where you're going to be ending. Unscheduled time available to think and dream. Do you guys have time to do that?
No.
It's hard.
I just turn off the radio on the way home, so I don't get paid to do it.
Okay.
But I do it.
Right. No, and that's a really interesting point about you do it on the way home from work. This idea of well-being is because your brains don't shut off at 5 o'clock. Okay, at the end of the workday, we're done. And you know, we have this, you know, baby boomer mentality of, I can't work if I'm not in the office, so I stay until 10 o'clock at night, because it's the only place I can work. And now, work happens 24/7. You're always on. So you may not be overtly doing work, but your brain, particularly, is always processing work information, particularly the kind of jobs that you have. You're thinking through that. So even over the course of the day, how do you manage your own work, you know, your own personal life at the same time? Because if you're stressed about something at home, you're not terribly creative. You know, you're worried more about, like, did the kids get off the bus? Did the kids get off the bus? Did the kid get off the bus and take the Rhine bus home? Like, so where is he? I assume you found him. He showed up.
Yeah.
But you like, when you become overwhelmed with those things and you can't focus on getting work done. So that's why work-life balance is so important. As people kind of get overwhelmed. So we tend to forget about those things. That people's state of mind isn't just as important as their state of being. Like, yeah, we brought everybody together, but if you're totally distracted watching, you know, like, okay, well, I have to keep, you know, we shut the phones off because we're all in here, but like, well, I have to keep it on because I need to, you know, make sure, you know, that call comes in, and that call's like 10 minutes late, 20 minutes late. you completely, disassociate yourself. So that well-being piece is part of it. And they're open to new ideas. And then we've got, what is the best way for individuals to complete this work? That's a $50,000 question, because everybody works differently, and so to assume that everybody's going to come in and do things the same way, when we do workshops with user groups, we always ask them about their work modes, and we actually do a little exercise so that everybody can see how everybody works. And the biggest thing that there's, well, engineers work like this, and IT, software engineers work like this, and finance people work like this, and then you put them go through this exercise, and you find out that's not true whatsoever. Because the way you get your work done has more to do with your personality, if you're introverted or extroverted, your work style, how you manage information, how open you want to be with working with others. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics, as opposed to like, oh, those people need quiet. Because if you started to add up all the jobs that are basically for introverts, it would take up 90% of the work population should be introverts, and they're not. So that's not necessarily an accurate perspective. Do we do creative things? Do you think of yourselves as a creative? Do you do creative things? Like, can you give me an example?
I used to quilt. I like to craft and garden, and I'm always trying to find some way different, mostly because I'm stubborn about how we can do things here.
So you're taking that same mindset and bring it into work? Okay. So how, as a group, how hard do you think you push your organization to do things differently?
How hard this group pushes?
Yeah.
I think we push pretty hard.
Yeah.
I would imagine that's why you're here.
I think we get pushed pretty hard too, to do things.
True.
That you get pushed?
Or to come up with different things.
Yeah, challenged to
Okay.
work better, do things better than we
More
do
with
them
less.
today. Yeah, more with less.
I
Okay.
think the fact that we
10
have
pounds in
this
a 5
room
pound bag.
says something about that too,
Yeah, it
right?
does.
Like, this room is here.
Yep, you're right. You're right.
Okay. Thinking about new ways. As an organization, is the organization open to change? So like I said, let me put it on a scale of 1 to 10, where you're a startup that doesn't even know what they're doing, so change is less like, we have no idea what we have no baseline, so anything is okay, to, let's say, the federal government. Since there's
We're
some.
raking them over the coals today.
Yeah. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how open is the organization to really like doing things differently?
Is 10 higher?
Yeah, 10 would be, we not that we know we need to do it, but we're open, because there are companies that say, yeah, we know we need to do it, but when you try to do anything, it's like, no, that's too far. So their willingness to change. What would you think?
I'd vote to the high end of the scale. I mean,
Way past the federal government.
There's a lot of talk about wanting to change, but when you get down to it, it's not.
it's a hard culture.
We still
Yeah.
wanna do the work
Yeah.
to change what we wanna change.
I would have said a solid 8.
Yep.
Okay. No, but that's a really, the willingness, and where do you think the resistance is? Is it from
Money.
doing the work or,
Money.
money?
Time.
And with healthcare, you've got a lot of people who are very set in their ways. You've got
Right.
doctors, surgeons,
Really?
we've always done it this way and we're not gonna change it because it works, or because I haven't been sued yet, or, whatever.
A lot of times I think is that we don't have time to fail, so we don't have time to try something new.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is one of the things, like failure in your world, well, not yours from the facilities, but failure in in healthcare doesn't bode well.
Yeah.
Particularly with, having a fairly litigious society, it's like, oh, you know, that becomes a challenge. So it is something that, you know, is part of your culture is, you know, managing risk. Because you go back to like, well, we know this works, so we're just going to keep it. Which is why an experiment like this, and to refer to it as an experiment, can be really valuable because it's, you know, how do people learn? You know, even on the science side of it, they learn through experimentation. Like they all had to start somewhere. Even a surgeon had to start with a dead body, you know, to practice. So here's your dead body, so to speak. But it looks good.
I'm relatively new to healthcare, so that's hence the cringe, but I'm okay.
So, all right, and creative, I hope to see no problem solved. All right, so asking about the unexpected outcome. Good, ask
What was
questions,
that
all right.
one?
So anything else you wanna add to this before we move on to make sure we have time for the next? This is great, so good job for that. So the next thing, is to take it, and be a little bit more, space centric, because obviously that's where I come in. It's like, yeah, there's this whole culture piece, but in the, when we start to look at the research around what supports creative behaviors, we look at these 6 dimensions, and we're gonna do a little rating scale here, but I'll explain what these are versus with the little tagline. So what we have identified through our research are these 6 dimensions or characteristics actually have spatial implications that actually influence the creative process. And some of them are bigger than others. Some of them apply to more team dynamics, but I'll sort of explain there. And then I'll go back through and do a little rating and think about how this particular space can actually be used to support the creative process, okay? So the first one is co-creation. So it goes back to this, this idea of generative collaboration. How do you create new ideas? And is it, in your world, is it more about one-on-one collaboration where you might, like somebody goes up to somebody else with, hey, I got an idea, or I've got a problem, or hey, can you help me think through this? Or is it a little bit more disciplined and is a little bit more planned where, you know what, I got this, you know, we have these things we need to work on, so I'm gonna bring in, you know, this group, and it might be a repetitive thing, you know, we gotta meet, you know, every day for 2 weeks to try to move something through, and it might be all of those. I mean, not necessarily, you know, this idea of idea generation is not a one-size-fits-all. So again, it's sort of thinking through, how do you create new ideas? Visualization. When we see, particularly with embedded teams that are co-located, being immersed in their content, this idea of information persistence is incredibly valuable. And we actually did a study with the University of Michigan about 10 years ago, and we took 2 different groups, and one was given a war room, where they put everything up on the walls, and through the project, they met in the same place every day, all their stuff was up on the walls, and the other team that was given the same assignment didn't have access to a room. They had to carry all this stuff with them, and every time they met, they had to put the stuff up and start, start over. And guess which team was more successful? Significantly, like they finished the project in half the time.
Wow.
It was huge. So we can get you this copy of the study if you want to see it.
Yeah.
But so the idea is when people are immersed in their content, every day they come into work and they remember where they left off. So this is where, when we talk about those agile teams for IT software development, sitting with your scrum boards is so critical because they meet every day to make sure that, you know, all of the different tasks were completed, and they move the little post-it from the backlog to the active to the complete, and they can see all of that. All of their whiteboards, the reason that these all stack is because nobody wants to get rid of the old whiteboard, because all that information is creating that narrative. And so you all created these post-its, And I think, you'll all remember kind of like what you wrote, but the process of seeing this and remember the dialogue is significantly greater because you were part of creating this. So you won't just remember what the notes are, you'll remember the conversations because it's visible. So if we leave this in here, every time you come in, you're gonna go, oh, I remember that, I remember that. And that that ability to keep information flowing is why war rooms become so important to teams that are meeting constantly, because it's about helping the team maintain this sense of group thinking. So everybody knows what where everybody is, and it's visible. You see it, and so you don't lose time trying to remember where you left off. So that becomes an important part of again, driving creativity, because it really drives to completion. Mental shifts. This whole thing about divergent and convergent thinking. It isn't about always being in the room together. Sometimes you have to separate yourself to actually go through that cognitive process by yourself, and you really need isolation to do that. And some people will want to go outside for a walk. I always think through, like when I do these kinds of sessions, I always figure them out in the morning when I'm waking up and in the shower. And that's when I this morning, like, I had all kinds of notes from TJ and what you were doing, and like the last couple of days it was like, well, what am I really gonna do? And that's where I sort of like, okay, here's what I think we should do, because now I kind of like, that's when your brain, the limbic region of your brain actually takes over, is when you're not trying to process information. So your prefrontal cortex manages everything, but it can only handle so much information. But this is why brainstorming becomes far more effective if you go through the exercise and then you come back the next day and you look at this and you will get the insights. Right now, you're just trying to process all the information. You can't make the connections here, and that's the biggest mistake that people make when they're doing brainstorming. And this is why we get into visualization, and that persistence becomes so important. It's the next day or 3 days later. It's the next board with some more information that drives to those insights. And that's where you start to challenge the system. Because right now, if I were to say, let's get this out, you're gonna come up with the most obvious things here, because you don't have time to process it. But backing off and letting that part of your brain that manages all that stuff work really is quite marvelous in what ends up happening. So we want to be able to make sure that people have that opportunity to engage and disengage. Social connections. If you don't all trust each other, you're not going to expose yourselves. I mean, mentally. Have to be careful in medical setting. But people, in order to really be part of brainstorming, you have to be a little vulnerable. And you're not going to really be vulnerable and put out some really wacky ideas if you think people are gonna like really? Or you think somebody's gonna take your idea and like, oh, well, if I say something like, Mary always takes credit for everything we do. It's like, so you have to have that sense of trust, and you get that through socialization. Just because you all walk in the room together doesn't mean you're really a community. It just means you all work together. But where teams really thrive is when they have that opportunity to do things like we came and had lunch first, and that makes a huge difference. Autonomy. We get into things you had here around empowering people to make decisions. So do you let people actually figure out for themselves? So even when I talked about making them move the furniture, giving that group that sense of ownership, so that they're not just using the space, they own the space. And the same thing, the way that they own the problem, that they own the solution. And this actually, I will tell you, in the big world of work, is the hardest cultural shift for organizations, because leaders have to relinquish authority to empower teams. And that's really tricky in lots of companies, because that's why they have, that's why they make the big bucks. It's, when you talk about, well, that's above my pay grade, Well, yes, some decisions are, but in the world of most work, like, the people who know the most about the situation tend to be not the ones that make the decision. And then we get to experimentation. And this is where letting people move things around is incredibly helpful to just create a mindset that things aren't fixed. And one of the issues that lots of organizations challenge with, their spaces are so precious that nobody wants to touch anything. You know, people don't leave stuff up on the walls because it looks messy, or the furniture's so nice, we don't wanna get, we don't wanna, mark anything up, we don't wanna leave a mess on the table. And so probably one of the best examples around a culture that really drives at this is Facebook. Facebook's favorite and most, the material they use everywhere, unfinished plywood, because they want it to look like a garage. All their wires and cables hang down from the ceiling. I mean, you talk about trip hazards. I mean, you guys would go in and have a fit because, like, there's stuff everywhere, but they want people to feel like they're working in their garage, and they refer to their employees as hackers. And they really want people that have that mindset. I mean, their mantra is go big and break things. So they create an environment that feels like you can break things and nothing's gonna happen. So if you want people to feel encouraged, like, you have to give them spaces where they can do something to it, so that they feel, again, it's just this mindset of this, I can do things without, being held, it's like, not that I wanna trash the room, but I don't feel like I can't put stuff up on the walls and I can't pin things up and we can't make a mess of the room. Because innovation is messy. Corporate America hates messy. They love clean desk policies. And I worked with, there was a couple of German companies, and you go at the end of the day and you would never know anybody worked there. It's completely devoid of any personality, of any work process. There's nothing there because they want no trace of it. And you have people who come to work and find a desk and see who's there, and there's nothing there to really incentivize people to ever do anything other than stare at their computer and do their job. And so there's actually some really good research around how those kinds of environments are actually detract from innovation, that the ones that have life and personality and ness, I think it was like the innovation went up by like 40%. So there's a huge difference in being people that sort of opportunity. So the first thing I'm gonna ask you is, score how important you think these attributes are to the work that you're doing here to drive this creative process. So we'll start here at co-creation. How might you describe it? How important is it to bring people together to create new ideas? So I think of this as a 0 to 5. How important is this? So we talked about, is it encouraged to help people, because that was sort of, is it an important part of it? Is it encouraged by the organization, to get people together to come up with new ideas?
So is this how it is or how it should be?
How it is today.
How it is today.
Yeah, how it is today. Let's do both. How it is today and where it should be.
I would say for co-create, from my opinion, it should be very high.
Should be.
It should be. Okay, so we'll,
be like a 5.
so we'll put it, all right, so we'll put a little star there, and then where is it today? Well, first off, does everybody agree? It should be there, okay. And then where is it today?
I think it's a 2.5, 3, maybe.
On a good day,
On a good day, a 3.
It does depend, like, who you're talking about. Is it interdisciplinary, or is it like across the department?
What if the department boundaries are what pull us back, right? That's how we get to 5.
Yeah, sure. How about if we say like a 3? Does that sound fair for today's
And we can,
co-creation
it doesn't have to be, this is not about driving to consensus. This is, we don't have to have,
Let's circle back to the consensus.
We're not talking about the precision that your surgeons use. Okay, this is not brain surgery. Literally.
Yeah.
I get to use that one here. This is not brainstorming.
You've been saving that one, haven't you?
No, I just sort of came
Oh,
to you.
okay, that's a good one.
Actually, I got to do so with actually some rocket sciences, and that was like the best one. Like, no, this is not rocket science.
Oh.
And I actually had.
You had a chance to use that.
Visualization. How important is visualization? Where should it be?
A 5.
It's very important.
For-
I was
yeah.
gonna say
Yeah.
7.
So-
So.
Okay, well, got it, all right. And then, how well, where is it today in terms of like where, is it, do you have places to keep stuff up and?
Well, we can put things up on our walls
Yeah,
and
we
stuff.
do, we have
You know,
some.
It's
In our own
it's
space.
independent visualization,
Right, there's no
right? It's not a-
collaborative.
a
There's no
team.
communal there's no like team-centric
No.
places.
This could do it though, I mean,
Uh-huh.
Mhm. Okay, so clearly.
this
Yeah.
will do it.
Yes.
Mental shifts, the ability for people to work both alone and together.
We're very
Where,
good with
where should it be?
I feel like it keeps saying 5.
It's really
Is it
okay.
okay?
It's really, it's really okay, cause this is really about, right now, setting goals.
Okay.
So if they all show up as, at the top of it, that's really okay. Cause, I mean, the thing is, we know that these are the dimensions that actually drive creativity, so
It's just gonna.
it's not surprising that they all show up pretty high.
Right.
So what about people's ability today? Are there opportunities for people to really do this?
We have a lot of opportunity for individual focus because most of us have private offices. There's no great space other than a conference room to do any group type work.
Okay.
And then it has to be scheduled and calendars are hard and so it
Okay.
brings
So
up
it's
pretty
probably-
low.
One.
Yeah.
But I do think it's achievable when we need it. I've always had
agree.
the opportunity to get a
Right.
conference room when I need it.
Okay.
But if
So-
you wanted to sit down with all of interior design on a regular basis, can you do it to talk about a problem you're having?
We have the fabric library that's.
But no, the time. Get the time.
Get the time.
I think we close.
We have a hard time getting equipment together.
We do. The other thing though, I think you guys are forgetting, as a group and projects, you guys are amazing. You deliver all sorts of things, cross-departmental, cross-department, cross healthcare boundaries, ambulatory, I mean, those type of things, I think you guys are really good at.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright.
I think we could score that one a little higher, but that, just from my
Yeah, me
observations
too.
too.
Okay, we'll stretch this out a little
There
bit
you
then?
go.
Yeah,
Alright.
there you go.
That's
There's
fine.
probably some variability across the teams, but I would agree. That
Okay.
is probably a little higher.
Again, no,
Not
it's the
rocket
conversation, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it's not like that we're gonna measure something. Social connections, how important is it to have a positive, a good sense of community?
Very. 5,
5.
10.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. And how is it now? 'Cause the fact that you've got lots of private offices, is there a social buzz? Do people
It
kinda?
used to be.
There used to be. Why did it diminish?
We're trying to figure that out.
All the fun people retired?
Dawn's still here.
Only the fun people participate. So, only the fun people make it fun.
Okay.
So, like, we do the monthly luncheon, and, I actually asked Lisa.
Do we do that still?
Actually, asked Lisa, who's on that committee.
Based on that, you're gonna
Yeah.
escort
Stop
over
inviting
there.
the manager to them.
Participating.
Oh my gosh.
Because they only have one person for chili so far. So, I was talking to somebody who's on our social, improve things committee, and she's gonna ask all of her cohorts to ask their people why they're not participating, but she thinks it's time.
Time.
And then she also said, or somebody also said, it's always the same people who contribute,
Yeah.
and they get tired of doing it all.
Sure.
Chili cook-off, if the same 5 people always bring in chili, it's, so it's a little bit of time, and getting those other people pulled into being interested.
Right, it's discretionary, and if, like, I have this, here's my workload, it doesn't really fit, so. So where would you score yourselves?
1 to 2.
1 to 2, so, right down there. Autonomy, empowering people to make decisions, to move forward, to bring ideas up.
Should be 5.
Okay. And what is the culture like now to support
I'd
that?
say 3.5 to 4, I think it's pretty
Oh.
good.
Okay.
Well, her boss is sitting right next to her.
My boss knows if she doesn't tell me okay, I'll do it anyway, so.
I was gonna say, I have no problem with Dawn being honest all the time. I
Okay.
love it about her.
And how many people are like you?
Nobody.
Okay. Well, that's the right, that's all I'm saying.
I hope they're not. I hope we hire and, put together teams like, because everybody has positive and negative things, and we
Right.
try and focus more on the positive.
Okay, right. But I guess in terms of empowering your employees to do what they think is right, is that prevalent
Managers like
with
that.
managers?
I hope so. I think we're getting better.
I
Okay.
think that
honestly
here,
do.
at the manager level, yes. Above that, institutionally, I don't know.
Okay.
And that's why I think we're getting better, because it takes that nod from above to go, I'm not gonna stab you in the back when you do that.
Okay, well, that,
I will say though, on this one, as a newcomer, the autonomy, I think changes based on what project or who's on the project, cause I have absolutely encountered some hand slap, you can't do that, that's, not how we do it, or that's, so we have some process things that I think stop autonomy, not so much
I agree.
people and management and the organization.
okay. So it's a little bit of the process.
A little bit, I don't know
Okay.
if that's an accurate way to
Okay.
bring
Yeah.
that in at this point or not, but.
Yeah, okay, no. And the last one, experimentation.
It should be 5.
Okay. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with them all being high.
I
And-
feel, go ahead.
No.
For experimentation, I feel like unless you have a executive leadership, support level person behind you, it's very hard to get people to buy into experimenting or trialing or doing something new. So you almost need that up top support to get off the ground and try new things.
So it should be high, but
It
it's
should be
a
high, but-
it's a challenge.
From my point of view, from my work, from where I'm at, I think it is a challenge to try new things.
I agree, because I think it automatically is viewed as failure, not, or
Or
learn
risky.
something.
Yeah,
I
there's a
think
cost
though
to it,
that
too.
that's because everything that we do is project centric,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
Our job is to run the project. So if we had a project where the job was to innovate, or to make a process better, or to,
Yep.
then it would be a different story, but we almost never have those.
Step back to look at the business, cause you're in the business, right? So, okay, so where would you score yourselves?
Probably a 2.5.
Really?
I would think it would be lower.
Pretty
Lower than
high.
that? Lower?
Yeah.
I say 1 to half to 1.
It's not fun to do, that's good.
Yeah. If
Let's
it
just
eats
try
won't
that,
let us.
lower 17, see what happens.
Yeah. If it doesn't work, we'll learn something.
Right, yeah, so somewhere in that range.
But also the time to do it though, because I think you guys are so focused on just trying to get through the day, there isn't any additional time, effort to do anything in a different way. It's always just go, how fast can you go?
Alright, so now that you've got at least point A, so you think about an environment like this, how might this space better support what you have for like co-creation?
Well, it's a space where you can come in with a buddy and start drawing on the wall or bounce ideas off of each other. Not that you can't do that in a conference room, but I think being able to have some control over what's in here and what you're using the surfaces for and the different way to support co-creation in here.
I think department meetings would be better, like individual departments, equipment, furniture, whatever, in here, because I could see once a quarter or whatever, all of us sitting down and saying, with like equipment, this is what we did in this project, and this is what worked, this isn't what worked. Bringing up the drawings and, you know, really being able to talk about it and stuff like that, I could see that. With furniture, because so much, you know, depends on how you're doing the space, and did it make it more cozy, like you said on Friday, did the sound bounce off and make it hard to hear, and, you know, somebody can come to you and say, hey, how did that work, but if you present it to the whole department, or everybody in your group, then they have a chance to think about that for their next project, and.
Oh, absolutely. So in the world of Agile, they call that a sprint retrospective. They go back and look at what worked and what didn't, and how do we make it better. In the world of Agile, they do that. That's part of their process. Is because it's always about process. You're part of the process. It's all about process improvement. So you get your hand slapped because the process didn't support. Well, how do you fix the process? Because you need to identify that the process doesn't support the activities. So, but those are the opportunities. And so, in the world of Agile, that's a big part of the rituals and the activity, because each sprint cycle they want to get better. So how do you learn? And that starts to actually drive a little bit more awareness about failure, because now okay, what did we learn? And it's not to say that it failed, but it could be better. And Agile is all about iterative improvement. If you don't stop back to look at what you did, so I think that a space like this really lends itself, because you have the informality, and sort of the way the room can be set up, so that people don't feel like they're a tribunal. Like, think about if you were presenting a project and you had everybody sitting around the table, like, are you really gonna, like, be willing to share, as opposed to, well, everybody's sort of sitting shoulder to shoulder? That dynamic itself creates a very different sense of value, and takes away some of that anxiety. Like, I'm not on trial for the project. This is for all of us to learn. And so, that's driven by the social nature, that everybody feels safe. That somebody's not gonna rip up, like, we did something here that, like, could have been better, and somebody says, well, are you stupid? Like, why did you do that? Why would you do that in the first place? I mean, that's not exactly the right attitude. Visualization. Obviously, you've got places to put stuff up. Is it something you've thought about, like, how long a team might spend here? Like, is it a half day, a day, a week, a month?
I would love to see a team come in here and maybe it's owned by a project for a week or two, or for a specific phase of that project, that the team sits and lives together, puts things on the boards, talks to each other. It's like real-time design, right? What did you do for electrical over there? And I gotta make sure my furniture lines up with that. And so I could see a space like this really supporting that kind of activity.
So the other opportunity you have, because you've got, like, the multiple walls, is the team may just need to be here for half a day, so they take over that wall and these things stack. So all their boards can still be here, and they can still have all their stuff, but they don't necessarily have to squat in the room. So maybe they're gonna be here for 4 weeks, but they're meeting in here every morning for 4 weeks. In the afternoon, other people can still use the room. The information is still here. So there's, so that may be,
Yeah.
you haven't thought through.
No, we haven't.
Right.
This is just patched. It's just here.
Yeah.
It's a newborn.
Well, yeah, so obviously you want lots of people to try the room, but then part of the innovation process is time and having and co-location. So you think about, okay, can you have opportunity to be able to store the information where other people can still use the room, and you can still keep it there. So you can keep it still as a shared resource, have it still, you know, they just took over those boards, which is why you just put more boards, buy more boards, right? That was the ABS plug, you need to buy more boards.
Sales pitch, 5 years instead.
Oh, you have carts coming?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
shipping later, so
Okay.
that way they can come down,
Yeah,
be in
you're
a
right,
car.
yeah, we have 2
and
cars
get 'em.
coming, yeah.
Okay, so there you go. You give the team a cart.
Yeah.
And they, you know,
Love it.
okay, in the afternoon, they just pile the boards onto the cart, and the
That's
next
a
day
really
they're right
good
there. The mental shifts, obviously, you're only gonna get, this is more for group activity. Do you see people coming in here for the group work, and then maybe for their you know, if they need some individual work, they might do that elsewhere, or do you think people might come in here and do both?
I have thought multiple times about putting my teams together in a room, just like Menlo, and see what happens.
Somebody died.
Maybe not one of my better ideas.
Still a good idea.
Well, why do you think, why not?
I got dibs on you.
Oh, yeah.
But this is the perfect place to try it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Stick
So
them in.
when we were all together at NIB, we all training happened so fast because we were all together. Yes, we were in cubicles that were, you couldn't turn around.
Yes,
and
but
look.
one person's attitude could affect the whole building, or the whole
I
room.
agree with that. But it
That's
could be
where I
fun
was-
for a week.
Yeah.
2
But-
days.
I like that
I
idea,
have been
Lois.
dedicated.
I think that's an awesome idea, you know, this whole experiment, think about like experimenting with the people.
Yeah.
You've got a space where you could do that, stick them in the room together
And we
and
have an
just.
observation window where we can
Yeah.
watch.
So when Dawn goes eat.
Don't Lois be peeking over the glass.
Okay, but no, I think that could be a really interesting
Yeah.
thing, because you would actually start to see the team dynamics. And then all of a sudden you realize what it may show is the value of co-location, that everybody's there together, which influences not just in this room, but how you think about space in the future. Because I will tell you, co-location is really almost more important than anything else, is when you get teams to sit together, they'll kind of forgo all kinds of other things if they're sitting together. Social connections. Obviously it's okay to bring food in here, people can kinda, so when you think about doing this open house in November, you know, are you gonna make it a little more social?
I think that's the plan.
Mhm.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
This place desperately needs a Keurig machine. So this
I have one at
space-
home, I'll bring you.
Coffee bar.
It's, yeah, I mean, don't underestimate the value of the snacks, refreshments, particularly when we get into things like brainstorming, because what ends up happening is you wanna remove all of those things that would interrupt the flow. And so that's why, you know, people bring in snacks, because it's right there, cause all of a sudden it gets to be like 2:30 and everybody wants coffee and everybody leaves the room, and you've disrupted that flow for the next hour. Cause nobody goes gets coffee in 5 minutes.
Right.
And you've broken the flow, so the Keurig machine actually there's legitimacy to keeping that all flowing. Autonomy, you know, again, if you move a group in here, will they own it? And, you know, can you make them feel like, you know what, this is your neighborhood? And so, you know, maybe they personalize it. You know, I say that very, you know, carefully. But one of the things we see what drives autonomy is identity. You know, teams want to, especially when you try to shift that idea that the team is the problem is around team centricity, we talk about treating the tribe as a unit, and the tribe needs an identity. And so, you know, when they're gonna be in here for a couple of weeks, how do they make it their own?
I like that idea.
So,
Yeah.
you know, they realize it's, you know, so like the fireplace, you know, we have some teams in Grand Rapids with our IT teams that at Christmas time, they actually built a mantle around the TV screen to show the fireplace.
Oh my God.
And hung little Christmas stockings over the TV screen. So, experimentation, we've talked a lot about the value of how this room can really drive people to, like, yeah, it's a tactile thing if they can get up and move. So I think hopefully you kind of see how a space like this can start to adapt, to really push some of the behaviors, because what you're really trying to drive are behaviors. If you look at a lot of what's over here, a lot of this is behavioral. It's how you think about your work. This becomes how the space can really suggest to people how they might behave a little bit differently, which changes their mindset around, you know, what is the work really all about? Because ultimately, it is about creating new value. You know, that's why, you know, the teams come together. And if you can create new value faster and with less obstacles and better quality, then you win. And that's really what we get to is like, you know, why does space matter? Because it actually positively, you know, we look at space as an enabler. It either helps people have a good day at work or it doesn't. I mean, it's a pass-fail thing. And so if you've got a space like this, but you start to think about those dynamics around how you might expect people to use the space, this gives you a little bit, hopefully a little bit better, a little bit better of a lens to think, well, why aren't they doing this in the space? Well, these are the kind of things that you might see as the big drivers that would make sense in a space like this, rather than, you know, it's completely arbitrary. So these are the things, again, as you think about your teams and who might be working the space, why might they come in here and use the space, and how would they use it? So you've got a little bit more, there's a little more discretion than just telling people, use the space and see what happens, but you can actually start to tell a team, use the space to do this. And then they, you know, for people that don't get the space matters thing, you know, this hopefully can give you some suggestions to direct a team coming in here. So why are you sending a whole team in here? We want them to, you know, it's an experiment. We want you to own the space so that you can start to come up with your ideas by yourself, and you're immersed in your content, so you can create a whole little narrative around why you would put a team in here and let them sit in here for a couple of weeks, because they've got a project, and you know what, for the term of this project, we're just you can figure out everything else you're doing, just get this done, and then see what happens. So any questions, comments, anything else you want to add? Did this help?
It was great. I thought it was enlightening, and seeing the different categories, the drivers behind the creativity in the workplace. I know for me, creativity is messy, it's exhausting work. So being able to go to a place that supports that kind of activity is going to be a big deal, and understanding each driver, I think, is going to help everything just become more clear. In fact, I have some ideas for demo week, what we could do to really focus on this graph here. So it's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and engaging. And hopefully this gave you some ideas around how you start to think about communicating the space. And this is when we did the research on these spaces, this is actually the exercise that came out of the research that would go into developing these spaces. So we just kind of yes. What we've done before is work with a group like yourselves around, and we would get the 5 stars. This is important. Talk about your existing space. Now we start to drive to what are the attributes of the space. You've already created the space, but this is typically the exercise we use to get to here. Like so, but now you've got the space already, but the space is designed based on these dimensions. So if you look at the Steelcase research, it may not be explicitly these, because I think we talk a little bit differently about them, but for the sake of the exercise, this is So this would, if somebody's like, well, where is this creativity research? Everything I just went through is all published. It may not look exactly like this, but the essence of all of this is published. So if somebody's like, well, where does this creativity crap come from? It's like,
We made it up.
it sounded good. It's great.
So do you guys have, change management consultants as part of the
Mhm.
service that
Yep.
you offer?
Yep. Yeah, so our whole team is, familiar with ProSci. So ProSci is the leading organization for change management, so our whole team is ProSci certified. So, we use their principles, which is, actually pretty simple. They follow this thing called ADKAR, which is, creating awareness. So this is, when people think about change management, they tend to think about communication strategies. Well, that gives you awareness. It tells some people something. Generally not everybody everything, because you only reach so much of the audience. The D is desire, and that's really the critical part of helping people know what's in it for them. Because they're not gonna be willing to change if they don't know why they should change, if they don't know what's in it for them, and they don't know why they should change if they're not even aware of what's going on. So this is all about the why you're doing it, not what you're doing. So typically in lots of building projects, you tell people what you're building, you never tell them why you're doing it. So nobody ever buys in because it's like, I lost my office, why did I lose it's a personal vendetta against them. Well, no, you don't have an office because we're changing the way we work and well, you never talk about that part. So this has to come from an executive level. This is about a business strategy. So if we can clearly, so what we end up doing a lot of is helping the organization actually define their ambition. What are you trying to accomplish with this workplace strategy to begin with, so that we can help people understand what it means to them. Then it's knowledge about what the change is and how to change, and an ability. So this becomes training. If you give people a new space, you have to train them. If you gave them new software, did you guys move to Epic or a couple years?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
So,
Was there change management with Epic?
yes, there was.
Yeah, because otherwise people don't do it. It's the same thing, you give them a new space, they're gonna walk in and go, so what do we do? And like, you teach them how to use this. You show them that the boards go up and down, that the tables are on wheels, and you actually show them that. You train them on the space. When people think, oh, well, we built it, they'll come and they'll figure it out. In the big, when companies do like these major overhauls and they expect that, and then they listen to people, bitch and moan for like 2 or 3 months. And the thing is, every time you make a change, there's a dip in productivity. So when you went to Epic, everybody, it was like, all of a sudden the workload goes up and everything's delayed because people are figuring it out. The same thing happens in the workplace. When you make the changes, there's going to be a dip in productivity. And ultimately, you made the changes because you want to see the productivity go up. And what happens more than not, because you move people into really crappy space to just fit everybody, productivity goes down and it never comes back up. So it's great that you saved on real estate, but, and the last one is reinforce. So this is where leaders have to be heavily involved with demonstrating the right behaviors, rewarding the right behaviors, so that you help to make sure that the changes stick. So that's a pretty straightforward process. And so that's the methodology that we follow. And so, we help organizations kind of plan through what that might be, but it's really helping, understanding what the change is.
Could you give a couple of examples of some engagements your team has done with either healthcare and or university clients, and like the scope of it and what the drivers?
So you know who Stryker is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Stryker Instruments is moving right now. They're moving into a brand new, unbelievably beautiful facility in Kalamazoo, and they're moving out of the 1,200 people, 800 are engineers. I think 500 are just R&D, and so I was actually, they hired me as their consultant, and what we did was, they had done a lot of work with, on their culture. So we used all of their culture initiative to be the change management drivers. The building just happened to be where it was gonna happen. So they wanted to create a culture of more accountability, more awareness, and more engagement. So, you know, and part of that, in the new workplace, their workstations were gonna be a little bit smaller, a little bit lower, more open. And of course, you had engineers just like, well, the company's gonna go out of business because we're not gonna be able to work. But we kept going back to, this is about creating more accountability, so you can't hide in your workstation anymore. And so we worked with them at a senior leadership level to define the ambition. We did workshops with all of the middle managers to help them understand their role in the change and what change meant to them. Because universally, the biggest place for resistance is not with the end users, it's with the middle managers. Because at the senior level, they tend to be the ones driving the change. The people in the middle who have to manage all the people have generally the most to change, and people forget about them. So you get actually a significant amount of resistance because they have to manage people differently, they have to change performance metrics, they have to, they may be losing their office. So all of a sudden you get actually a tremendous amount of resistance at that level, which then doesn't reinforce the changes that need to happen with the individual contributors. So, I put Stryker in the category of big engineering companies. They just have to make medical devices. But in engineering companies, they're very hierarchical, they're very conservative, and so we wanted to make sure that we worked with each layer to understand where their anxiety was. And even like with the engineers, you didn't listen to us. So part of the communication strategy was always reinforcing all the user input they had, which was, they did a survey for programming where they got like a 92% response rate. They held like 42 focus groups. They did 40 hours of observation. They did all these workshops. So there were a bunch of engineers who said, you didn't listen to us. Or you didn't ask us what we wanted. Well, actually we did. You're just not getting what you wanted because you wanted more of what we had. That's not where the company's going. So we kept using it kept going back to, why is Stryker doing this? Not, yep, we know you're not really completely happy with where it ended up. This is why they're doing it. So, and so now the transition is going much better because there's a tremendous amount of awareness. I mean, they've done site visits and videos of the space, and every Friday they did a video, Fastback Friday, where they did a video of something going on the project. Everything from the last one they sent me was the president of Stryker Instruments and one of the senior VPs doing carpool karaoke driving around the building and stopping at Starbucks because there's a Starbucks in the building. It's hysterical. Here's the president of Stryker on video, and then they had all.
But those are all things they're doing as part of the change management to change the culture.
Yeah, this is he goes, this will be great, we can get coffee, and we're gonna have these places. But you've got the president talking about how we're gonna be working differently in the new building. So you've got,
And that's part of the reinforcement, yeah.
So that's one example. I'm doing work right now with Spectrum in Grand Rapids because they're building a center for transformation and innovation. So, and that's just starting. But I'm part of the core team to, work on that. The education market, we actually have somebody that specializes in education, Sudhakar, and that's becoming a bigger part of it. So I haven't really done that much in education. Even in this world of healthcare, I've actually done more than when I started thinking about it, I've actually done more than I realized, but I usually try to stay out of it. So I did stuff at Dartmouth University's hospital system. They did something for the University of Minnesota's ambulatory care. some change management stuff
Yeah, but
there.
there's always, there's always the clinical and the
Yeah.
administrative parts of,
Those were
machine
both-
medicine that go
yeah.
together, it's not.
The ambulatory
we have
care
both-
was a clinical space,
Correct, yeah.
Dartmouth was
Yeah.
an innovation space.
Yeah, and so with my customers, I always say, even though I'm a healthcare, I focus on healthcare, I don't just focus on the clinical spaces. And the issues that the organization is, struggling with, and the tensions, and, the things that keep them up at night are all still the same across the corporate world, across institutions, these are universal things. We just happen to be in the healthcare business. But still, those issues around, creativity and innovation, that affects every organization across industries and sectors, and many other topics. So, I think the fact that, I asked for a healthcare or, for comfort level, but certainly, if we're talking about an administrative space, for example, we have many organizations that we, as examples. If you'd like more information on it.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, yeah, so I thought, but stuff like this is applicable, is universally applicable. Obviously, when you get down to the next layer, when you get to the programming side of it, well, then I'm not gonna be the one to tell you like what goes off, I guess it's the on the carpet, off the carpet thing. Yeah, if it's on the carpet, I'm okay. Although I did do a psychiatric hospital once, but that was probably more carpeted, the walls and everything.
Behavioral health.
Yes, I had to learn all of them.
Yeah, right.
And my daughter's a social worker, so I should know these things. But she wasn't at the time, so it was, I did learn the word asylum was no longer acceptable. Cause they actually did refer to, it was a former asylum, but now it was the, inpatient, or, I forgot, the resident facility or something. They had some really nice way of putting incarceration.
Well, some of those old buildings
I guess that's not the right term.
You gotta be
No, that's
socially
not.
correct.
You need to test it again before you let him out.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah, that's
sorry.
right. Yeah.